Good morning or good afternoon, everybody. My name is Natalie Wallace. I'm the Senior Manager at Ceres, leading the Investor Initiative for Sustainable Forest. Thank you very much for joining our speaker series today. We are delighted to have Emily Krebs and Gillian Gladstone present their latest findings on company disclosures, including corporate rankings and scores, and more importantly, or as importantly, corporate progress towards their zero deforestation commitments. If you have any questions and pressing questions during the presentation, please write them in the chat room that is on the left of your screen. But we will leave 15 minutes at the end of this presentation for questions, and you can then unmute your line and ask your question directly, or write your questions, and I will moderate questions and answers at the end of this session. At this time, I would like to introduce our two speakers today. Emily leads the full range of investors initiative for CDP North America, including advancing the global investor strategy. And Gillian leads CDP's work specifically on deforestation in North America, supporting companies to remove commodity-driven deforestation from their supply chains. Emily, I will let you kick off the presentation. Thank you again to both of you for doing this and helping investors understand more about corporate
Really happy to be speaking with you all today. As Natalie said, I lead CDP's work on deforestation with our North American stakeholders. So I've, through my role here, had the opportunity to interact with many of you in the past, both the investors on the line and some of the other NGO stakeholders, and really happy to be speaking with you all today about the launch of our 2017 Forest Scores and, as Natalie said, importantly, the corporate progress that we're seeing. So let me just start with a very brief sort of background of CDP for those who may not be as familiar. CDP was founded to tackle climate change at its source by giving the world better definition of the problem and potential solutions through corporate environmental disclosure. And we provide a framework to collect standardized data to shine a light on the most complex problems of our time and connect that data to market forces like institutional investors, so that we can begin to shift behaviors in line with a sustainable economy. So this slide just gives you kind of a high-level snapshot of CDP's scale. So we have nearly 6,000 companies and over 500 cities reporting to CDP this year in 2017. We have more than 800 investor groups and 100 large purchasing organizations that are requesting this information. And while we started with our climate change questionnaire, we've also expanded to collect information on water use and deforestation commodities over the last few years. So within the more than 5,800 corporate responses received this year, more than 200 of those are responses to our forest program, and that's obviously what we're going to focus on today. So CDP was started 17 years ago. Since then, we've seen a continuing year-on-year increase in interest from both investors and purchasing organizations in wanting companies to provide information about how they're managing critical environmental issues like climate, water, and deforestation. And in 2013, the Forest Footprint Disclosure Project was brought into CDP's portfolio to become CDP Forest. And in 2017, we now have 803 investors. As I mentioned, 634 of those investors represent the ask out on water information each year, and 380 of those investor signatories are backing the request for information on deforestation each year. So just gives you a scale of the investor signatories that are a part of our network. And these investors range through all different sizes, types of investor groups, and have global representation. And I'm just going to pause here and see if by any chance Emily has been able to join us at this point. If not, I'll continue. Okay, apologies for the technical issues.
Jillian, we're trying to get Emily. Emily should be able to speak if she presses *7 on her phone. Thank you, Emily. Sorry about the technical difficulties.
Okay, I'll just continue on. Emily sends her best, and apologies for not being able to participate. So I just want to highlight here the way that CDP data is used. Now, some of you on the phone will know that you may have used CDP data directly as signatories to the CDP asks, but another critical way that CDP data is used is by underpinning a lot of the data used by the market. So we like to say CDP is the essential first step for business action on the environment, and it's the leading platform to measure environmental disclosure, insight, and action. And we have the most comprehensive set of global corporate environmental data needed to track business progress on climate, water, and deforestation. And the way we use this unparalleled data set is by working in partnership with a lot of the organizations and companies that you see on the slide here that provide research, data products, indices, and ratings and rankings directly to companies, investors, and consumers. So CDP really underpins many of those other kinds of data products that you might already be using. So now just to dive a little bit into the 2017 disclosures and really the history of disclosure through CDP. We've seen a 33% rise in disclosures through our investor program since 2013, with particularly strong growth in companies disclosing to the water program this year. However, with just over 3,300 companies disclosing directly to CDP investors through our platforms, we really think there's still a lot of progress to be made. About 60% of the world's 6,000 largest companies are still not responding to requests to disclose their environmental impacts, and we rate them with an F for failure to provide sufficient information to be evaluated as a motivator to get those folks disclosing. And particularly on the forest side where I work, just over 20% of the companies that CDP deems to be at risk due to their production or procurement of forest risk commodities are currently disclosing. So that leaves a tremendous opportunity for investors to push for greater transparency. And I'll come back to this point in a few minutes. But I just wanted to pause to highlight the remarks of our CEO this year. Actually, just yesterday as we launched the scores, Paul Simpson said the transition to a low-carbon economy will create winners and losers within and across sectors. And as new businesses and technologies emerge and scale up, billions of dollars of value are waiting to be unlocked, even as many more are at risk. So really, what we are always focusing on are both the risks that companies face, and many of these are inherent in the business they do, but also the related opportunities that are really available for companies that have the ability to measure, monitor, and manage their impact in these critical areas. So I'm going to move on to talking about the 2017 A-List, which we just launched yesterday. This is hot off the presses, so I'm really happy to be sharing this information with you guys today. Each year, CDP scores the thousands of companies that disclose to us across our 3 themes. We analyze a diverse range of metrics to produce a letter score of A through D for each company across each theme. And the purpose of this is really to harness the competitive spirit of business to raise ambition and spur action on corporate sustainability. So this screenshot is the A list, which is the list of all those companies that earned an A this year. We recognize 159 companies who earned an A on one of the 3 themes. Those A-listers include Colgate-Palmolive, Diageo, J. Sainsbury, Sky plc, Sony Corporation, Unilever, L'Oreal, and many more. I'm going to be focusing in the rest of the presentation on the Forest A-list, but I invite you to check out the full leader list as well as complete scores for all disclosing companies. You can find those on our website at cdp.net and scroll down to the CDP Scores 2017 button. And I'm happy to say that it's much easier to look up company scores this year. We have this new snazzy tool on our site. So for those of you who are used to looking up company scores in the past and found it a little bit burdensome, you'll be pleased with the format this year and your ability to scroll through and see how a lot of different companies are doing across the different programs. But now to focus specifically on forests. So I mentioned CDP added the Forest Footprint Disclosure Project to our umbrella of programs back in 2013. This reflected a recognition of the tremendous value of tropical forests and the corresponding risk to companies of not managing those resources effectively. Now, I know many of you on the call today will know this, but just briefly, forests provide key ecosystem services. Tropical forests account for half of terrestrial biodiversity and supply 75% of the world's accessible freshwater. Tropical deforestation and forest degradation, of course, are major contributors to climate change, causing between 10 and 15% of all GHG emissions. And by addressing deforestation, we know that we could achieve up to 1/3 of the carbon mitigation needed annually to keep temperature rise in check. So while many of these impacts have been recognized by the private sector and the investment community, those groups sometimes fail to understand how these physical impacts translate into financial impacts. Now, CDP has found that based directly on the corporate disclosures that companies disclose to us, over 20% of their revenues are at risk from deforestation each year. And globally, we found that $906 billion in revenue is put at risk each year by deforestation. So what does this tell us when we say almost $1 trillion at risk due to deforestation each year? Really, we know that there are tangible supply and financial risks that can't be ignored by companies and financial institutions if they want to be operating in the new climate economy. And conversely, there are emerging opportunities that forward-thinking companies should be actively aware of to realize business advantage. So what companies do we see standing out from the crowd in their management of this issue? Well, this brings us to this year's A-list. So I'm really happy to share the A-list companies that CDP is recognizing this year. These 6 global companies have been identified as leaders in tackling deforestation based on their disclosures through CDP. These 6 corporates make up 3% of companies participating in CDP's Forest program. And they're included on that leader list in recognition of their actions in the last year reported through CDP to combat deforestation, and that's both in their supply chains and direct operations wherever relevant. So CDP allows companies to improve their understanding of risks related to deforestation while identifying and engaging with companies in their value chain that are not currently taking action. And some of the activities that we focus on are things like carrying out audits, running workshops and trainings, or offering technical support to suppliers. So that's a critical component of the forest performance that we're looking at. Scores are awarded separately for each of the 4 commodities that companies may be reporting through CDP on, and those are timber, palm oil, cattle, and soy. And one of the reporting trends we see is around performance between regions. As you'll see here, a number of these companies are Nordics. So we're really seeing those Nordic companies leading the way, 3 of the 6 hailing from that region. And other forest leaders come from France, the UK, and Australia. So despite seeing strong climate and water performance from U.S. companies, as well as actually really significant forest disclosure rates from U.S. companies, I'm disappointed this year that I'm not seeing quite the level of performance that I'd like to from some of the U.S. companies. So that will definitely be a focus of ours going forward. But again, really happy to congratulate these 6 companies for their strong performance. And I guess I should say for anyone who may be called in and not looking at the slides, the 6 companies are L'Oreal, Brambles, Unilever, SCA, Tetra Pak, and UPM. And I do want to highlight L'Oreal in particular. I'm sorry. Sorry, I think the slides are caught up now. Okay. So L'Oreal provided a really strong example of using supply chain traceability to reduce reputational and physical risks in their disclosure this year. With a commitment to zero deforestation by 2020, L'Oreal already sources 100% of its palm oil derivatives from RSPO certified sources. The company worked with external stakeholders to design a tool, the Sustainable Palm Oil and Traceability, to evaluate the environmental and social performance of all its products. And in addition, L'Oreal uses the Global Forest Watch tool to identify risks further down its supply chain, such as palm oil mills' commitments to zero deforestation. These programs and tools have helped L'Oreal reduce risks associated with deforestation, allowing it to map its supply chain and trace back 91% of raw materials to the refinery level and 74% of raw materials up to the palm oil mills level. So by supporting 500 smallholder farmers in Sabah, Malaysia, L'Oreal has increased its availability of certified sustainable palm oil, helping to future-proof the business by reducing reputational and physical risks. So we're really happy to celebrate them this year. One other company that I'll just sort of note is Unilever. Unilever was the only company to be awarded A's across all 4 forest risk commodities: palm oil, soy, cattle, and timber products. And both L'Oreal and Unilever this year earned A's on their disclosures across climate, water, and deforestation. So hats off to those companies. Now, I just want to note the forest leadership criteria. So what does it actually mean to be a forest leader? I talked a little bit about supplier engagement, but just to break that down a bit, companies receive a score for each of the forest risk commodities they disclose on, and getting at least 1 A on those commodities allows them to be considered for the A list. Best practices associated with a high score for forests include anti-deforestation targets, sustainable sourcing policies, and high levels of traceability. Now, some of you may be aware, for each of our programs, CDP publishes a public scoring methodology, and that methodology is based on the steps required by a company to progress towards leadership on that program, so whether it be climate, water, or forests. Our questionnaire has progressively assessed companies on their willingness to disclose information on their own assessment of deforestation-related issues, on the extent to which they've addressed deforestation-related risk, and finally on their actions to manage that risk. The score indicates how much a company is committed to transparency and action regarding its deforestation risks for each commodity. Now, deforestation issues are frequently linked to specific local context, meaning the methodology in its current form doesn't attempt to assess the impact of companies' disclosed deforestation risk, nor does it attempt to compare measures of impact across individual companies. So that's important to note. Now, just one more note about this. In order to achieve leadership status, there are certain requirements beyond showing strong disclosure, awareness, management, and leadership around deforestation a company must achieve. Leaders first should have committed to zero deforestation by 2020 throughout their supply chains as well as in their own operation. To be able to do this, companies should have an understanding of the scale and origin of deforestation-related risk commodity production and consumption. And finally, leading companies have board-level oversight on forest risk governance, and they've also undertaken a comprehensive risk assessment of their own operations and full supply chain. Now, our mission is to advocate for disclosure as well as improvement, and the latter area will continue to be a strong focus area for us in the coming years. In past years, we've seen a clear link between strong corporate performance on deforestation and board-level oversight, with U.S. companies lagging significantly behind their European counterparts on that particular criteria around board-level oversight. We'll be releasing the full results of the CDP Forest disclosures, including the content of the responses, more in-depth regional and sectoral trends, and analysis and guidance specifically for investors and lenders when we launch our 2017 Forest Report on November 21st. So we'll get into some more of those trends, see if the board-level oversight issue continues to be kind of a proxy for strong corporate performance when we launch that report. And we'll be marking that event, that report launch, with in-person events in London and New York. And I'd be happy to include any interested investors at those events. So feel free to reach out to me for more information if you'd like to join us. So the Forest A-List, as I said, is released alongside the Climate and Water lists on CDP's website this year with case studies from leading companies. This is the first year that CDP has announced company scores across all three areas simultaneously, and that's really reflecting a holistic approach from us to the environmental challenges facing business today. I mentioned CDP ranked 156 companies out of the total 3,000 plus through our investor programs. So the 156 were all ranked as A grade for at least one of the responsive climate, water, or forests. So this year, we're seeing these companies reach leadership at a time when getting onto our A-list is actually more challenging than ever. By tightening the criteria companies must receive to get an A score, we've made that top spot more competitive and more coveted. So you'll no doubt notice that we have a very small representation of companies on the Forest A-List this year as compared to the other programs. And I think there are a couple of reasons for this. One is that CDP's Forest program is the smallest of our three programs, with only 860 companies globally asked to disclose. And that's based on the exposure to risk through one of the forest risk commodities that we have evaluated. The Forest program is also the newest program to CDP, while climate disclosure, for example, is much more established. Across all of our programs, as I said, we have stricter leadership criteria this year, meaning some companies that have previously received A-list status did not this year. However, I don't think that all three of those things fully account for the discrepancy. While the leadership rate among disclosing companies is smallest in forests, the disclosure rate from all requested companies is also smallest on forests, with only 24% of requested companies disclosing this year. So we really believe that companies are overlooking the risks deforestation poses to their business. As I said earlier, tremendous global GHG emissions come from deforestation, and we know forests provide essential resources and ecosystem services. I think companies understand those links, but are failing to see how those impacts directly reflect on their companies and their financial risk that could be felt by companies. I mentioned earlier companies that do report tell us roughly 20% of their revenue is put at risk by these impacts. And so this is really a message that I think we, investors and other NGO stakeholders need to be echoing out to companies that this is a real financial risk for companies, and that those that haven't started to track their impact really need to do so. And that, of course, helps companies better understand the risk, but also puts them on the path towards improving their management of deforestation. And just on that theme of disclosure engagement, we still have a significant number of companies with very high relevance on this issue who aren't disclosing. So the companies you see in front of you are the key high-impact, non-disclosing U.S. companies from the 2017 sample. So these will be key targets for engagement over the coming year. And if any of these companies are of particular interest to you, or if you have ongoing engagement or dialogue with any of these companies, I'd be happy to talk further about a strategy for incorporating deforestation reporting into your existing dialogue. Now finally, I just want to reiterate, through CDP, I mentioned more than 800 institutional investors with assets of over $100 trillion are asking companies to disclose how they're managing risks posed by climate, water, and forests. International coalitions of investors with billions of dollars under management are requesting greater transparency on climate risk at general meetings of the world's biggest producers like BP, Shell, ExxonMobil, and Chevron. But we need to see that same ask for transparency of high-impact companies translate into water and deforestation action as well. Already 1,800 companies are responding to the Paris Agreement and the TCFD recommendations for climate disclosure. And major financial institutions, including Barclays and Santander, have given their backing to the TCFD's recommendations, including disclosure of climate information, water, and land use as part of mainstream financial statements. Now, CDP has undertaken a major effort to reflect the recommendations of the TCFD into our 3 questionnaires, meaning that in 2018, companies that disclose will be TCFD compliant. Thinking about forests specifically, we know that neither the Paris Agreement nor the Sustainable Development Goals will be achieved without addressing deforestation. The TCFD recommendations, we believe, are a springboard to delivering the commitments of the Paris Agreement and things like the Sustainable Development Goals. So we really feel that now more than ever, disclosure is absolutely imperative. So I hope to have the opportunity to work with you all to help drive more and better disclosure. And I'll leave it there and happy to take any questions you may have on this topic.
Thank you, Jillian, very much for this very good presentation and very informative data here. I wanted to check at this time if Emily had joined us. I see that she has joined us. If she could speak.
Yes, I am here.
Thank you, Emily. Sorry about the inconvenience. Please go ahead.
Sure. Well, I think Jillian touched on sort of a background of CDP and the importance of disclosure. But I just reiterate what Jillian said is that from our perspective, we work with investors to encourage corporate disclosure along the different verticals in the broader environmental space. But I just when I speak with both investors and companies, one of the things that I think is critical is for leaders to really set the agenda for what it means to disclose along environmental lines. And the forest disclosure touches some very specific industries, which Jillian highlighted in some of the A-list companies. And I think that there is a significant opportunity for investors who are looking to engage with companies and drive the dialogue for companies' environmental disclosure in the forest sector in particular. So I would open it up to questions certainly from the audience. We can talk in detail about TCFD And in our questionnaire, how it's impacted investors. We can talk about forest disclosure and such, whatever direction the group would like to take the discussion.
Thank you very much, Emily and Gillian. At this time, please unmute your line if you would like to ask a question, or use the chat room if you would like to write a question, and I will moderate this session. I'll start with, I have a few questions, especially as you mentioned, Emily, on the importance.
The conference has been unmuted.
Investors asking for disclosure as a main point of engagement with companies. And Gillian mentioned traceability and disclosure of traceability, especially, if I remember well, LOreal and Unilever are doing a great job at disclosing on that factor. Besides disclosure according to TCFD and traceability, I mean, what do you think investors should emphasize in their dialogue and engagement with companies? Or are there specific factors in traceability and disclosure that investors should focus on?
Well, I'll start off, and then on the traceability, I'll turn it over to Gillian. But I think one of the things that we're seeing where companies are able to differentiate themselves in the eyes of investors in terms of disclosure is if a company has their business practices aligned so that environmental disclosure and consideration of environmental issues don't sit simply within the sustainability department, if there is one, but that the sustainability department works with the finance department, works with the corporate planning department to really integrate the concept of environmental considerations into all aspects of the businesses. So, for example, if a company undertakes CapEx improvements, have they made an allowance for what that will mean, what that CapEx improvement will cost, not just from a monetary perspective, but from an environmental perspective and from an operations perspective with the environmental bent included in it. And I think having that dialogue connecting into the business, not just sitting in the sustainability department, is a sign of a company that is well managed, where senior company management is thinking about the importance of environmental issues and the financial opportunities that could potentially come with that. Also, when that discussion is raised to the board level and the board accountability level, that's again a sign from our perspective that the company is considering the financial and environmental risks and opportunities of climate change. And I think that it's not often emphasized enough that there are opportunities for innovation, for new business models with respect that come with a greater understanding or greater transparency around environmental disclosure. I'll turn it over to Gillian on the traceability point.
Sure, and so in terms of traceability, what we're looking for is for companies, and this is sort of consistent with CDP's approach, is we tend not to have one solution that we're advocating. We are a platform for companies to tell us how they're approaching an issue, where they see risk and what the opportunities are for them, of course, but then also what action they're taking to address that. So, we see traceability sitting alongside things like setting standards for procurement or production, using certification or some company-specific procurement guidelines, as well as supplier engagement. Those are kind of the critical action areas that we stress. And particularly in traceability, what we are looking for is the extent into a company's own supply chain that is able to establish traceability. and then what kind of mechanism the company is using to track traceability. And of course, this is going to vary between the commodities that a company is tracking. The means for establishing traceability is very different in palm oil than it might be in cattle or timber. And likewise, the depth into a supply chain that we expect companies to be able to trace is different on different commodities. But the principle stands that is an important element of a company's kind of action plan.
Yeah, so thank you, Jillian. Actually, on that point, we talked in the past, the quality of disclosure between the different commodities, especially with a good work done by investors on engaging companies in the palm oil supply chain. So could you comment on this difference in disclosure, and maybe I'd love to have your perspective on what investors can do in terms of improving the quality of disclosure in the cattle and soy supply chains?
Yeah, definitely. So you're right. I think your instinct that companies are demonstrating stronger disclosure and stronger action on palm oil than on cattle, for sure. What we've seen, and the full sort of analysis of this will be launched in our annual report on November 21st. But what we've seen in past years, for sure, is that companies show the most sophistication in their reporting and management of timber and palm oil. And I think that probably reflects a longer history working kind of intensively on those commodities, but also greater kind of public awareness and attention through consumer campaigns, as well as greater investor action perhaps also around those commodities, whereas we see soy and cattle lagging a little bit. So I think what we are calling on from investors is really to continue to emphasize the sort of critical relevance of soy and cattle supply chains. We know that, and there have been some studies, I think, on this, cattle actually contributes the greatest rate of deforestation globally, greater than palm oil and timber and soy. And so, that's a supply chain where there's a critical need for investor action to help companies sort of start by measuring their impact and reflecting on the risks they face, and then moving on to really acting to engage suppliers and establish stronger procurement standards and expectations on that commodity as well.
Thank you, Jillian. Emily, any comments on this front?
No, I think Jillian really hit the nail on the head when she said that the differing rates of disclosure for different commodities depend on the level of interest and the level of engagement. And I think that's true if we take a step back and look at not just the commodity-specific disclosure, but forest disclosure overall. And the fact that it hasn't necessarily been the first area of environmental disclosure where investors have turned their attention, but it is an incredibly important part. And I would emphasize that environmental disclosure doesn't move all at the same pace across different industries, different commodities, but given the opportunity to engage with in the highest impact areas, we like to work with our investor members and signatories to really encourage that engagement. And so, looking at the list of companies that Jillian put up, I think it was on slide 13 or so, where we see an opportunity for investors to understand both the risks of not disclosing for forests, but also engaging with these companies over the coming year to really encourage them to look again at their forest and commodity related disclosure opportunities.
Thank you. We have a question from the chat room from Matthew. Can you speak a bit more about the metrics you used for A, companies, disclosure, engagement, transparency, for example, and
yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So I touched on this a little bit in a previous question about traceability, but let me take a step back. So we sort of look at sort of buckets, I guess, of metrics. And you'll see if you look at the CDP scores that company scores companies are scored between an A and a D, and those scores kind of align with what we consider the stages of leadership or stages of management of these issues. So the first is disclosure, sort of a willingness to disclose information. Specifically in the forest context, we're thinking about things like asking companies about their total consumption and production volumes. We're asking companies to disclose just on the facts of what commodities they're working in and how they're managing those commodities. Then after disclosure, we move on to awareness, so a company's own assessment. In the forest context, we're thinking about their assessment of risks and opportunities that face the companies. Then after awareness, we look at management, or a company's ability to address deforestation-related risks. So that includes things like corporate governance. That includes risk assessment. So what kind of processes and systems does a company have in place to manage this issue? It would also include things like setting targets or adopting a no deforestation commitment. And then finally, we're looking at leadership, so the actual actions a company is taking to manage the risk. So you can think of this as kind of the difference between setting a commitment and then actually meeting that commitment or implementing. And let me actually just flip back to the slide that had the specific leadership criteria. So like I mentioned, commitment to zero deforestation by 2020 is a specific leadership criteria, as well as a comprehensive risk assessment, disclosure on commodity use and the scale and origin of those commodities, board level oversight. And then in addition, I would say falling into that, that sort of action bucket, we would put things like using standards or certification to assure your production or procurement are meeting certain criteria. Traceability we talked a little bit about, and then supplier engagement is really key. That's a huge part of this for companies that are managing these commodities in their supply chains.
Yes, thank you, Jillian. Looking at this A list and the companies list that you mentioned on this slide 13, I wanted to hear from your perspective, because we're looking here at consumer-facing companies. Are there any results, and can you share any information on the commodity trading companies, such as the ADM, Bunge, Cargill, and Dreyfus, and other producing companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we've actually been really happy to see pretty active engagement from those companies by and large. Cargill has been responding for a number of years. Bunge and ADM both started responding in the past 2 years. So all three of the sort of ABC of the ABCD are all responding now to the forest requests. And they're obviously critical parts of these supply chains, and transparency from that supply chain stage is crucial because it allows the manufacturers, the consumer goods products companies, and the retailers to better understand what's happening in their own supply chains. And actually, just as a side note, to sort of further along this goal of helping link supply chains together, CDP has actually now extended our supply chain model, which I referenced at the very beginning of the presentation, that we have investors as well as customers asking for information. So we're now allowing companies like manufacturers and consumer goods products companies to request through the CDP platform information from their own suppliers, so the companies like Cargill and ADM and Bunge. Louis Dreyfus is the one exception to the ABCD group who are still not disclosing, and we really hope to see that change next year. But by and large, we've seen good engagement from these companies, I think because they are feeling quite a bit of pressure from their customers to share information. So that's been encouraging.
Thanks, Vivian. Emily, do you have any comments on this?
No, I think Jillian did a great job describing that, and we reiterate, we're very excited about our forest report launch coming up. That's going to take a sort of detailed look at some of these companies on the industry-specific level.
Yeah, thank you. We're really looking forward to that report, November 21st, right? Looking forward to that. I have one last question. On slide 14, regarding disclosure, as really topic du jour, you mentioned investors endorsing and responding to the recommendations of the TCFD. Could you maybe share with us your thinking and your strategy to understand more how you at CDP will use the framework and the guidance of TCFD regarding disclosure, especially in the commodity sourcing and consuming companies, and what's the linkage between your work at CDP and TCFD?
Sure. Why don't I lead off on that, and I can have Jillian chime in. So the TCFD, or the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, was the brainchild of Mark Carney, who's the head of the Bank of England. And CDP has been, and CDP's disclosure over the last 15 years has been instrumental in helping shape some of those guidelines. With the conclusion of the task force and their final report on June 29th of this year, the goals for the TCFD have been widely disseminated, and CDP's disclosure over the last several years has been relatively well aligned with that. However, for 2018, as Jillian had mentioned earlier in the call, we've gone through a process called Reimagining Disclosure, where we've made sure to align our disclosure questionnaire completely with the TCFD guidelines, so that in the absence of required registration or required disclosure for companies along TCFD, any company or organization that wants to point to their voluntary disclosure along the TCFD guidelines simply needs to point to their disclosure response to CDP. So if we imagine it from a financial perspective, there are financial reporting and disclosure requirements by many of the regulatory bodies in various countries, and TCFD is a similar type of thought process, but particularly focused on the climate-related issues, and it's currently voluntary. So as companies move forward and as regulations and policy change, and the TCFD framework is adopted in various forms, companies who disclose to CDP are already prepared for that, in the sense that they're already aligning their environmental disclosure along the guidelines set by the TCFD. Does that help differentiate between what CDP does and what TCFD is asking for?
Yes, definitely. I think you mentioned alignment, which I think will be key. It's something that investors in Europe and in the U.S. Are really looking forward to in terms of disclosure, but also engagement and framing engagement around these guidance. So that's really helpful to have the tools to be able to analyze and understand these companies through that lens. So that's very good. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, and to be clear, CDP is a disclosure platform. So we offer a stage for companies to disclose and to align all of their disclosure. And the questions that we are asking for companies to be able to sit on that stage are aligned completely with the recommendations of the TCFD. So we've had questions from investors over the last several weeks about whether TCFD is replacing CDP or competing with CDP, and that's not necessarily the case. It's actually TCFD is providing the framework and the disclosure, and we are providing the platform on which companies can publish that disclosure. And by answering the questions that CDP has set out in our disclosure questionnaire, they are de facto disclosing under the TCFD recommendations.
No, thank you. That's very helpful. I just want to make sure, Jillian, would you like to add anything to this?
I think Emily covered it very well.
Yep.
Happy to leave it there.
So at this time, we don't have any further questions. Please, Emily and Jillian, if you want to have your conclusion and last words.
I think the one thing that I would say, representing the investor side of CDP, is we look forward to the opportunity to engage with all stakeholders in the I'll call it fight against climate change with respect to disclosure. And so we work with our NGO partners, we work with investors, we work with companies, and so we welcome any type of opportunities to engage with you or to help with your efforts and engagement.
Great.
Thank you very much. Yeah, go ahead, Jillian.
Yeah, I would just say from the forest side, I think a lot of the folks on the line today already know how critical this issue is, but I think what we we would echo that, but then also, the extent to which this is an issue that's largely still not being understood fully by the private sector in terms of its implication for business. And so, we just think there's a real clear call to action for companies and the investors who engage with those companies to really, take seriously the task of measuring impact on the company through the risks and opportunities that present themselves. And that really sets the stage for companies to then start to address their real world impacts on deforestation. So, again, I would encourage investors on the line to raise this issue with the companies that they're dialoguing with, even if they don't fall in that list that I shared. It's a critical issue for companies across a whole range of sectors who are purchasing these raw materials. We'd be happy to engage directly with any investors who would like to talk about specific companies they're working with.
Yeah, thank you, Jillian. This is I'm glad you mentioned that. And we have this collaboration with the PI called the Investor Initiative for Sustainable Forests, and we are really working hard to present business cases of the risks and material risks of deforestation in the supply chain. Our expert here, Dr. Julie Nash, has done a lot of work on this linkage between deforestation driven by commodities such as palm oil, cattle, and soy through the Engage the Chain and research. And we are coordinating with the PI, a group of investors, so a lot of whom are on the line today. So thank you for the investor work and bringing that material risk in front of corporate management and to eliminate deforestation from the supply chain of commodities at hand here, palm oil, cattle, and soy. Well, with that, I will conclude this. That will conclude our webinar today. Thank you very much for everybody for joining. Thank you to our speakers for a great and very informative webinar. We look forward to see your report on November 21st and continue this discussion of improving disclosure and traceability to be able to control and eradicate deforestation from the supply chain of these commodities. Thank you again and have a wonderful day.